Joe Brady stood in front of reporters today and said he still hadn't decided which of his starters would actually play in Saturday's preseason game against the Browns. And that single piece of information changes how you should watch everything that happened at today's joint practice. If the Bills' starters sit Saturday, this session might be the only real look we get all week at how Shedeur Sanders handles a completely unfamiliar defense wearing a different jersey. And that made today worth showing up for on its own. Let's start with the first team period, because the setup here matters just as much as the plays themselves. Deshaun Watson took every single snap with the ones in that opening 11-on-11 session, 6 total, while Sanders worked in for 6 snaps of his own, 4 of them with the starters, and 2 mixed in with the second unit. Dillon Gabriel got 3 reps with the third team, and Taylor Green picked up the final 2. From the outside looking in, that split felt genuinely fair for a joint practice setting. Nobody was getting buried on the bench today. What actually stood out early was Watson pushing the ball down the field, something this competition has been waiting to see from him. There was a real vertical shot attempt in that first period, and I think it matters because a Browns reporter on site said they'd overheard a Bills defender describing this offense as, in his words, check down city before that throw happened. Make of that what you will. But it's notable that the deep shot came right around the time that kind of chatter was reportedly circulating on the opposite sideline. Whether that's coincidence or a response to being called out, either way, it's the first time in a while we've actually seen Watson test a defense vertically instead of settling for the underneath completion. I want to sit with that detail for a second, because it says something about how this entire competition has been perceived from outside the building. If opposing defensive players are noticing a pattern of short, safe throws on tape before a joint practice even starts, that tells you the league is already forming a book on this offense the way it's currently being run. A defense that trusts everything in front of it to be a checkdown is a defense that can sit on routes, jump underneath throws, and dare a quarterback to actually push the ball vertically. Watson answering that perception today, even in a low-stakes practice setting, matters more than the single throw itself. It's a signal, whether or not it becomes a consistent pattern once real football starts. Sanders, for his part, didn't get a ton of clean opportunities in that opening stretch. There was a rollout to his right where nothing developed downfield, so he tucked it and picked up what the defense gave him on the ground, which is exactly the right decision when nobody's open and you're not allowed to be touched in a scripted period like that. Another play died simply because a fullback dropped a catchable pass in the flat. No fault of the quarterback there at all. Honestly, through that first session, I found myself wanting the coaching staff to trust Sanders with more actual passing opportunities, instead of leaning on the run as often as they did. He wasn't getting the volume of throws to really show what he could do against a new opponent yet. And that's a small frustration worth flagging even in an otherwise fair rep split. Then the pads came out for a 7-on-7 period. And this is where the day genuinely turned in Sanders' favor. He found Isaiah Bond on a dig route working across the field. A clean connection that got chippy after the whistle, which tells you both sides were competing with real intensity, even in a practice setting. Then came the play of the day. Sanders hooked up with a receiver making a real push for one of the final wide receiver spots on this roster. And it turned into a 50-yard touchdown on a dig route that split the coverage perfectly. That's exactly the kind of throw a receiver fighting for a roster spot needs on tape, and exactly the kind of anticipation throw that shows up when a quarterback trusts his read before the separation is even fully there. Think about what that specific connection means for both players involved. For the receiver, that's the exact kind of splash play that gets circled by a coaching staff heading into final cuts. A 50-yard touchdown against an unfamiliar defense in a setting with real intensity attached to it. That's not a rep that gets buried in a depth chart conversation. For Sanders, it's another data point in a growing pattern, this camp of him building chemistry with the receivers fighting hardest for their roster spots, not just the established names everybody already expects to make the 53. That kind of trust with the back end of a receiver room is exactly what an offense needs once injuries inevitably start piling up during a real season, because the quarterback, who already has real chemistry with his WR4 and WR5 options, is the quarterback whose offense doesn't collapse the moment a starter goes down. There was another moment worth slowing down on, because it directly answers a criticism I keep hearing about Sanders and his processing. On a free play after a penalty against the defense, he had a chance to push the ball vertically, with zero risk attached to the outcome. He put the throw in a spot that looked like it sailed a little wide of his intended target at first glance, but that overthrow was actually the smart decision. On a free play, if you underthrow it, or put it on the receiver's frame and the defender is draped all over him, you get nothing. Throw it up where only your guy has a real shot, or where the defender has to interfere to prevent the catch, and you either get a completion or a flag. Sanders put it in exactly that spot, drew the pass interference, and flipped what looked like a wasted rep into real yardage. That's advanced situational football, not a lack of football IQ, and it directly undercuts the narrative some voices in this market have been pushing about his processing. He backed that up with another connection to Bond off a different free play, showing the same kind of fast recognition and trigger, and then moved the chains on a 3rd and long conversion to Denzel Boston that kept a drive alive when the down and distance wasn't in his favor. 3 different examples in one practice of a quarterback reading a live situation correctly and cashing in on it. That's not schemed production. That's processing in real time against a defense he hadn't seen all camp. Watson's second 11-on-11 stretch is where things got genuinely rough for him. And I want to walk through exactly what happened, because multiple reporters on site independently described the same sequence, which tells you it's accurate, and not a single observer's spin. He got picked off in the red zone by Bills safety, Jordan Hancock. One account tried to frame that as Watson working with second-team teammates around him at the time, but I watched the throw, and Watson threw that ball directly into Hancock's hands himself. The ball was touched, the read was wrong, and no amount of context about who else was on the field changes what actually happened on that specific rep. I'm not interested in manufacturing excuses for a veteran quarterback on a rep like that, and I don't think the tape supports one either. That interception wasn't an isolated moment either. According to another account from the practice field, Watson overthrew Harold Fannin, who was standing wide open in the corner of the end zone on a red zone snap that should have been an easy touchdown. The very next play was a jet sweep that lost yardage. The play after that, a defensive back read the route and picked him off again in the red zone. That's 3 straight uncomfortable snaps in the area of the field where turnovers hurt the most. A separate reporter's account described a similar bad stretch. A sailed throw to a wide-open Fannin in the flat, followed a couple plays later by another interception over the middle, this one again credited to Hancock. When multiple independent voices on the ground are describing the same rough sequence, that's not a narrative being manufactured. That's just what happened. I keep coming back to how much this specific stretch matters, given exactly where it happened on the field. Red zone efficiency is one of the clearest predictors of whether an offense actually wins games, because every possession that stalls into a field goal or a turnover instead of a touchdown is points left on the table against a league where close games get decided by a single score more often than not. A veteran quarterback with Watson's contract and his track record is supposed to be the steady hand in exactly these situations. Tight windows, condensed field, less room for error. Instead, this stretch showed the opposite, back-to-back-to-back breakdowns in the one area of the field where a quarterback's decision-making gets magnified the most. That's the kind of pattern that should worry a coaching staff far more than a single incompletion in open grass ever would. Sanders closed the day with a 2-minute drill that on paper ended in a sack and an incomplete final throw. But the context here matters enormously. He drove this offense the length of the field with no timeouts remaining, operating under exactly the kind of pressure a real fourth-quarter comeback would require. He got sacked near the end, and his final shot toward Denzel Boston in the end zone fell incomplete. On the surface, that reads like a failed drive. On the tape, it's a different story entirely. Boston had been catching passes from Sanders at an extremely high rate throughout this entire offseason. And on this specific rep, the defender covering him grabbed his left arm as the ball arrived, which is exactly why Boston had to fight through contact and go up with one hand instead of using both. I actually had to rewatch that play myself because the one-handed attempt looked strange in real time until I caught the hold on the replay. Good coverage, and I'll give the defender full credit for winning that individual battle physically, because if the flag doesn't come out, the defense wins that rep, regardless of what actually happened in the fine print. But it's worth understanding that the incompletion wasn't purely about Sanders missing a throw. It was a genuinely tight, physical rep decided by contact that didn't get flagged. Now, let's get to the tracker, because the numbers tell an interesting story on their own even before you layer in context. Sanders finished 13 for 23, with 0 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Watson went 12 for 17 with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Dillon Gabriel was 4 for 7 with no touchdowns and no picks. And Taylor Green went a perfect 3 for 3 with a touchdown of his own. Looking purely at completion percentage, Watson's numbers look cleaner on the surface. But I'm still giving the overall edge to Sanders today, and here's my reasoning. He protected the football completely. 0 turnovers across 23 attempts against a defense he'd never faced before in a live setting. Watson turned it over again, and this isn't an isolated incident for him. He's been turning the ball over throughout this entire offseason in a pattern that's become impossible to ignore if you've been tracking this competition closely. Completion percentage matters, but ball security matters more, especially in a league where turnovers decide far more games than yardage totals ever will. I want to be fair and share what some of the Browns beat reporters had to say about today, because their read wasn't identical to mine, and it's worth hearing both sides. One voice on the broadcast made the case that Watson actually had a really nice day overall. Sharp and decisive in the periods where he was rolling, and specifically credited him with pushing the ball down the field in a way that simply didn't show up during the earlier preseason game against Chicago. His broadcast partner largely agreed, acknowledging that the red zone interception to Hancock wasn't good, and that the overthrow to Fannin absolutely should have been a touchdown, regardless of who bears more responsibility for it. But that same reporter also said the first 2 or 3 periods of practice were genuinely some of the best they'd personally seen from Watson since he arrived in Cleveland, specifically praising a seam throw to a rookie receiver as one of the better throws Watson has made all camp. And on Sanders, that same reporter didn't hold back either, calling his growth from a year ago night and day, and crediting the entire offensive coaching staff, along with Sanders' own individual work, for putting him in position to capitalize on the reps he's been given. So, where does that leave this competition heading into Saturday? My personal read is that Sanders is still ahead in this race overall, and I don't think it's particularly close when you weigh everything together. This thing isn't finished either, because there's still one more preseason game against these same Bills coming up this weekend. And if Sanders goes out and has a strong showing there, that's going to pile even more pressure onto a front office that already has some tough decisions ahead of it. Even if the organization ultimately leans toward Watson to open the season, he only gets a limited runway to prove this version of him is sustainable before the turnovers catch up to him again, the way they have all offseason. When that happens, and I do think it's a matter of when rather than if, Sanders is going to be right there waiting for his opportunity. Everything that happens on a practice field in August has a way of showing up on Sundays eventually. Every player in this league knows that. Every coach knows that. And every fan paying close attention this preseason knows it too. I don't think this is a situation where the front office is under any illusion about what they're currently seeing either. Organizations don't build quarterback competitions like this one by accident. If the plan from the beginning was simply to hand Watson the job regardless of performance, there wouldn't be nearly this much time, these many reps, or this much genuine competitive structure built into training camp. The fact that Sanders keeps getting real first-team snaps, real joint practice opportunities against unfamiliar defenses, real chances to build a case, tells you the door hasn't actually closed, the way some fans and some corners of the media keep insisting it has. Doors that are truly closed don't usually stay open this long into August. Cleveland is off tomorrow. No practice to break down, but Saturday brings the real test. An actual preseason game against this same Buffalo roster. That's where we'll finally see how much of what happened on a practice field translates once the game is officially on the line, once the disguises get more genuine, once the reps stop being scripted and start being live in a way that actually counts toward final roster evaluations. If today was any indication, that's a game worth clearing your schedule for.